The title of this sounds a little bit plagiarized from my own dissertation, because I called that one Catching the Rain, and this one is called Catching Rain. But the title of this actually isn't mine. It comes from a Kenyan who started the whole sand dam phenomena. And so I'll try to walk through that if I remember to take the right devices across with me. And the place where this started is in Kenya to the southeast of Nairobi, which is the capital. But it's in an area that varies between sort of sub-humid highlands to semi-arid landscape. And the problem in the area is basically water. So if you look here, is Nairobi, and you see down this direction, you have a little pockets of highlands that show up as dots of green on this map from, I guess I got it from Google Earth, and then down in here, Taita Taveta and some other places. But where I was working was mainly in this region right in here. And I say I was working, actually I visited, okay? And I'm not going to claim that I have anything to do with the ideas that all this is founded on. The one thing I contributed to this particular program is giving it publicity. I could write, so they needed somebody to write about it, so I did. The area gets rainfall between 800 and 1,200 millimeters in the highland parts of it, and that's where I ended up starting out when I was visiting there. But as you can see, it goes down into the 400 to 600 range as well. And that makes, in a bimodal rainfall system, which this is, because we're equatorial here. Remember that the equator comes right through here and just on top of Mount Kenya and the top part of Lake Victoria. And so that means all this area is within 2 degrees of the equator to the south side. And therefore it has a bimodal rainfall system. So when they give you an average, it sounds, 800 millimeters sounds good enough for corn. But really it's not 800 because they only get 400 average per season. And so that's really marginal. And so if you're trying to grow maize in that environment, and a lot of people do, your chances of success are about 1 in 4. But that's 4 rainy seasons over 2 years. So you have to keep that in mind with this thing. So water becomes something that you have to think about on a regular basis. The fellow who founded the organization called Utooni Development Organization is a guy named Joshua Makusia. And Joshua was obsessed from a very young age with water, because when he was in primary school in a little village called Kola, which is where Utooni is located, he had to carry with him an empty water jug when he went to school. And he went from his home and he walked down to the bottom of the hill, across an ephemeral stream, and back up the other side of the hill to the primary school on the other side of the valley. And then when he walked home, he had to walk down the hill to the bottom, then walk in the stream bottom until he found a place where you could dig in the sand and then scoop water into his jerry can. And when he was in primary school, it was only 5 liters. When he got into middle school, it was 10 liters. And when he got, I think, about 13 or 14, he started carrying 20-liter cans home. And he had to make sure he came back home with the can full or he would get caned. Mom wasn't very appreciative if he didn't have water, because water was their most important thing to gather. And so when he got older, one of the things he said to himself is, why, if the rain falls on the roof and runs off down the hill, do I have to then run down the hill after it and catch it? Why can't I catch it on the roof? And so in their compound at the Utooni Development Organization, and you can see they have a little sign back there, maternal and child health care, they do a little bit of that on the compound. They had this 220,000 liter water tank. And all the buildings on the compound are connected to this tank and the one over here, which is 60,000 liters. And then on the other places in the compound where they couldn't get the pipes to reach, they put other water tanks between 5 and 10,000 liters. So the whole compound held 350,000 liters of water at the end of the rainy season. And then they didn't have to go buy it. He just didn't like to have to run and catch water. And so catching rain, that's where the title comes from, him trying to figure out how to catch rain. And they had some interesting ideas about catching rain. And this is one of them that was unique. This was down in Makueni, which is a drier county than Machakos and lower elevation and relatively flat. And so it didn't have the same kind of advantages that they had up on the hills. I'll get back to that later. So they had to think about different ways of catching water. So one of the things that they had were these little outcrops of granite that didn't erode, and the soil around these granite outcrops actually eroded away, so they look like mountains, but they're not. They're just extrusions of granite in a basaltic plain that had eroded off. And he thought, well, why not we catch the water off of this rock? So they put up these little low cement walls around this particular rock, ran it down to this corner, and then ran the water over into a couple of large tanks that they filled up. These each hold 150,000 gallons. And then this woman, who's the chair of the local self-help group, manages this water, and they sell it for, I think, about 3 shillings a jerry can. For an income for the group. And there's about 25 women in this women's self-help group in this area, so they manage that water for them. So this is one of the ideas that they had for catching rain. They also like to grow trees, and I threw this in primarily for Louise because we worked on agroforestry together, and one of the things we came up with after the first year of projects, which didn't work terribly well, was that we were using the wrong trees. And so often we'd collect information. I did most of this in a lot of ways in a little book that I wrote. But one of the trees that we really liked and was a favorite in this area was something called Melia volkensii, which is the tree you're seeing in this picture. But no one could figure out how to make it grow. It was kind of a mystery. You put the seed in, it wouldn't germinate. And even the entire time I was in Kenya, I was there for 4 years working on things, I never met anybody who knew how to grow it. In fact, some foresters from England were working on it. There were some Kenyan foresters from the highlands that were working on it. Nobody could figure it out. But it did grow in the wild, so it had to germinate. But no one could figure out how to do it. But somebody from this development project actually figured it out. And what they found was that when you take the husk off the seed and open it up, there still is a membrane inside that husk that sticks to the outer covering of that seed. And that membrane has to be cut open before water can penetrate to cause the seed to germinate. And wildlife probably did this by accident. Maybe 1 in 1,000 seeds would go through an elephant or something and get popped right, and it would germinate. But foresters didn't figure it out, but this high school kid finally did, and now they have plantations of it out there. It's a favorite tree because it is very resistant to termite damage, and so it's a favorite construction tree that they put up. And it grows well in dry areas. So they're doing this, and you'll note underneath it, a lot of vegetation. They're also using this as a cut and carry grazing area. So they cut and carry during the rainy season and then store it for hay for the animals. Most of the landscape that I visited, though, didn't look like the previous pictures. It looked like this. And the characteristic of this particular landscape is ephemeral streams. These are streams that do not have surface flow of water most of the year, only during the rainy season. But they are streams that have a bedload of sand. And sand gradually moves out of an environment through time, but it moves slowly because it's hard for the velocity of water to hold it. You have to have a pretty high velocity of water to keep sand up. So it tends to drop out of solution quite a bit faster than, say, silt or clay. if you have a soil science class, you go through and you do that little experiment where you mix soil in and shake it up, and the sand settles out in 30 seconds, and the silt takes half an hour, and the clay sometimes doesn't do it at all unless you add a coagulant. Well, that's what happens in the rivers. The sand settles out really fast, but the silt and the clay continue on downstream, so you end up with a bed load of sand. And the landscape nowadays looks like they really are trying to control erosion off the slopes, but they have a lot of terraces and other kinds of things to try to control things. But the real hard part about this landscape is dealing with water, because it is dry frequently. And getting water becomes a major factor that they have to deal with. And you can sort of see that in this picture. Everything looks a little bit off, even though this picture is still, the maize is still growing on the fields. And it's hard to tell really up in here, but that's an almost mature crop of maize, but it's not yielding very much because the water is a limiting issue on it. And women have to spend a lot of time walking down to those streams and fetching water in 20-gallon jerry cans. The one in the back is carrying a full 20 gallons. The one in the middle here with the maroon top, she's carrying about 10. But women do most of the work when it comes to water, and they're often the target audience of Utooni Development Organization. So water is this huge limiting factor. And one of the things you talk about in agricultural schools, anyway, and I learned that here, is this idea of limiting factors. It comes from Justus von Liebig back in the 19th century in Germany. And if you can see it, you look on those staves of the barrel there, and there's a nutrient named on every stave of the barrel. The one that's lowest where the water is coming out is phosphorus, P2O5. And then the one next to it is nitrogen, there's calcium, and there's potassium, and magnesium, and manganese, and copper, and zinc, and boron, et cetera, et cetera. So it's got a lot of those things up there. And his idea is that the productivity of any agricultural system is determined by the least available nutrient in that system. Okay? That was how he phrased the law. But Liebig, when he was dealing with all this stuff, was in a really exciting age of 19th century chemistry, and they were just learning what the periodic table was made up of. And so they got overly excited about nutrients. And he didn't really talk about the fact that there were other limiting factors in agricultural systems. And so you have to think about that when you're in these kinds of areas. And land is also a limiting factor in agriculture. If you don't have land, you can't grow anything. It's pretty major if you don't have that. But labor is also a limiting factor. If you don't have enough hours in a day, how are you going to take care of your crops? If you have to do a whole bunch of other tasks. Water is big. And water then can also contribute to the labor problem. If you have to spend your labor using water, then that limits the next phase. Climate conditions are important too. So if you have a bimodal rainfall system and no one season gives you quite enough water for a crop, you either have to change the crop or just hope that you grow a big surplus when you do have enough rain. And then there's also things that come from outside. One of the big things back in the 1980s when we were there is the beginning of structural adjustment programs done by the World Bank and other kinds of things, trying to straighten out third world economies. They didn't really work very well, but they became limiting factors in themselves because development organizations following the guidelines actually prevented things from getting to the people that needed them. And so there's all kinds of limiting factors that you can find. And then there's also input costs. How much do things cost? How much is fertilizer really? I ran into that quite a bit, more in Mozambique than in Kenya, where people just couldn't afford any of those nutrients that are listed up there. They didn't have the cash. Cash economy wasn't functioning, so they couldn't get it. And so input costs became a limiting factor in their agriculture. You had to find some alternative to that. But the big one in the area that I was at in Machakos and Makueni, and then this one happens to be in Kitui County, is water. And Joshua Makusia, who is not in this picture, had to really learn his own lesson about this. And so I'll tell that story while you look at this picture. In the 1970s, he worked for a group called the National Christian Council of Kenya. When he was there, he did a number of things with some of the people who'd been in the organization for a long time, and he visited some dams that were built by the British during the colonial era, before 1962. And he had that in his memory, but about 1978, he got really tired of working with the National Christian Council of Kenya, and he went back home to try to do development activities in his own area, which is in this Machakos, Makueni area. In fact, he lives right on the border of those two counties. And when he got home, he decided that he wanted to form, with his neighbors, a self-help group. Now, self-help groups in Kenya are actually registered by the government, so they're an improved kind of community organization. And so they put together a self-help group and paid the fee to get registered by the government. And they just had a small one. It was only three couples that were involved in it. And then they had to decide, okay, what are we going to do as a self-help group? Joshua wanted to plant trees. He was a big guy on agroforestry, and he really wanted to grow trees. But the women in the group, especially his wife, said, no, we're not starting with trees. We are starting with water. We have got to do the water first. Then you can do your trees, but let's solve the water problem first. That's the one we're the most concerned about. And so Joshua started thinking about water, and he remembered these dams that he'd been to with the National Christian Council of Kenya. And one of the features of these dams that this guy showed him was that they had all filled up with sand. But when you dug in the sand, there was water underneath. And so he said, why don't we do that on purpose? The British didn't want their dams to fill up with sand. They were trying to do power grain mills to grind the grain. But with Joshua's idea was, why don't we do this deliberately? So he and these other two couples got together and formed, they had the organization, and they got some resources together, and they built a dam. They had to find the right kind of place that had a rock foundation on both sides of the stream and in the bottom. They had to put in some rebar and some cement to get it started, and brought in rock, and all the sand was already there. They didn't have to bring that in. And they built a dam about 2.5 meters high in the middle of this stream and blocked it off. And after a year, 2 rainy seasons, the thing had completely filled up with sand. But when they walked down to it and dug down 2 inches, there was the water. And as the season went by, it got lower and lower and lower, so they had to dig the hole deeper and deeper. But this dam was stopping water only 15 minutes from their house, where they had been walking over an hour. That's, 45 minutes saved in just collecting water. So you can either collect more, or you can collect it a lot easier and then have labor for something else. And in fact, that began to free up labor. And their neighbors that weren't in the group wanted to join the group. And as the group got bigger, they had more stream that they could access, broader group. They built another one. And in fact, they raised the height of the first one too, to 3 meters rather than 2. And so they expanded the process. And in that process, they began to realize that they could form a local non-government organization, which they called the Utooni Development Organization, to help other groups get started doing the same thing. This also inspired another group, and that's where this picture comes in Kitui, called SASOL. And so this is the first dam under construction that I visited in that area. And when I was taking this picture, this girl in blue suddenly hopped in and got into the picture and stood there, kind of at attention. And I really didn't know what the heck was going on. She just appeared and stood there, and then after I finished taking the picture, she kind of smiled and walked off. And so this fellow here, and I don't remember his name, and I have her name written down someplace, but this fellow here came up to me and he said, do you know who she is? I said, no, I have no idea. Why did she get in the picture? He says, she's in charge of this project. She was the chair of the development group, the self-help group, that was in this particular area building this dam. And she was organizing 30 families to build this thing. She was in charge of the labor. She got all the labor together. The other guy in the white shirt on the right side of the dam is the engineer. He's helping with the construction process, but he doesn't live there. And you'll notice in the background of this picture, there is a terrace that's freshly dug in the background. What she had to do before this SASOL came in was organize the community to build 2 parallel terraces on each side of the dam that were equal to the full length of where the sand would be backed up behind that particular dam. Those terraces are designed to help protect the dam from getting flooded with excess runoff of clay and silt from eroded sides of the dam, so that during the construction time they wouldn't get damaged and other kinds of things. But it was also designed deliberately by both SASOL and Utooni to develop the idea of working together in the community. Because if you look at that terrace, you're not talking about building this thing with a tractor or a caterpillar or something like that. You're talking about building it by hand with hose. It takes an average of 2 days, or 1 day, one person 1 day to build 2 meters of terrace. Okay? They built 4,000 meters of terrace, which is 2,000 person days of labor. And she organized that entire project, 2,000 person days of labor, for this community group. And then, at that point, when it was approved by SASOL, they provided the input for putting together the dam. What they need to do to put together the dam is bring in cement and rebar and wire to help reinforce the concrete. And so but the development organization wouldn't bring that in until the group proved that they had the community spirit already in place to manage the project. And that was proven by building those terraces. And this group, they figured that this group would probably save an average of 2.5 hours a day collecting water once this dam was in place. This was in 2009. And that's why they were interested in doing it. You save 2.5 hours a day, you've got both water, one limiting factor, and labor is freed up for a lot of different tasks. And so lots of communities are doing this now. Over the last 30 years, they really started in earnest around 1988, I think it was, so it's 32 years ago, to do these dams on a regular basis as a group. They're up to now 3,500 of these dams in place in the 3 counties, Machakos, Makueni, and Kitui. And they build them as a group in places like this. So most of the people you see in this picture are locals who have been organized to do the labor to build the dam. In this case, they're using forms, which is the type of dam that Utooni builds. In the other case, they use rock to form the sides of the dam. Whoops, too fast. Okay, this is one of my personal favorite pictures because I carried sand at one of these dam sites in the construction process. We got to go as a group with the James Madison University Study Abroad program, and we spent 4 days at this one site building a dam with a community self-help group. And we had to carry sand from an upstream dam about 250 yards upstream from the new site. So we had to carry it down in gunny sacks, essentially. So I did that with these women. And they did not speak English, and I did not speak Kamba. So they were walking behind me, and they were apparently talking. I'm told that I got proposed to a lot because I was the only guy in the sand carrying line. Everybody else was women, and they liked to fill my sack when I got up there. So I didn't even have to fill my own sack. Very, very honored, as I was the old mzee in that particular project, which was kind of fun. But they had a good time doing this because they already knew the benefits of the dam. They had one, and they wanted more because there wasn't quite enough water for their entire community. So they had this building their second one. Dams, when they're completed, look something like this. This gives you a good view of it. And there's some characteristics of the dam that almost immediately take place when they get built. For one thing, you get more water. But one of the things that happens is you start getting a lot of growth right on the side. You're expanding your ability to have rich riparian vegetation. And in the case that you see here, it's a lot of grasses. But the reason I put this picture in is you can see how much sand is held behind the dam. We figure that in some cases the amount of sand is enough to hold about 10 million liters of water just in the sand that's trapped behind the dam. So that's 10,000 cubic meters of water that is now available to the community that they didn't have before. And that doesn't count the impact of raising the water table behind the dam, which can then leach more water into the dam area itself. So you're really adding a lot of new water supply to a community when you go in. And some of that is taken advantage of by the plants on either side. The next slide shows those plants a little bit more closely. And you can see in this case it's a lot of grasses. And in the picture here, these grasses are being planted even on the sand directly itself. And that has proven one of the most important products of these dams. Because what often happens, doesn't happen in the middle of the day, because like mad dogs and Englishmen, when we went out in the noonday sun, they don't get water at noon in these sites. They get water in the early morning mostly when we weren't out there. But what they do is they bring their animals down in the morning and dig a hole, or if the hole's already dug, they often protect it. But they'll get a hole and they'll let the animals get full of water. While the animals are drinking water, they go off and cut these grasses on the side and then load them onto the animals. And then the animals carry their own fodder back up to their houses. And if they have a donkey, they'll load the donkey with water and carry the water up at that time too. But they get the human water from a different hole than they let the animals drink from, so there's limited mixing. And that way they get both the fodder and the water and the animals watered all at the same time. Don't have to carry water for the animals. So that grass is so valuable, they actually plant it from cuttings, and that's what they're doing on the left side there, so they can get more of that fodder grass. And what they found, Utooni, in their studies of this, is that has increased milk production in the cattle and the goats that they're feeding this grass to. As that milk production goes up, the dietary value for the children goes up, diseases go down, and they actually have increased attendance at school. So directly or indirectly, they're actually helping the community in a lot of ways through the process of just supplying water that then supplies grasses. And then it also supplies food. So one of the things about this country is that you cannot grow bananas through most of the farming area unless you have groundwater that the bananas can reach. And so behind the Napier grass, which is in the front, they dig pits, usually about a half a meter to a meter deep, and then they plant cuttings of bananas. The bananas produce offshoots as they grow, and then you take that cutting from the side and you can plant that separately and make a new banana plant. They plant cuttings down there, and then those bananas yield pretty much continuously. So banana has been added to the diet in a lot of these places that was not there before they had the sand dam. And that's a fairly important calorie input. They also get a lot of other fruit trees. This one is, the bananas grow faster and start producing earlier than some of the other fruits. But in the background that you can't see, they've already got mangoes and papaya and some other things started that are behind the bananas there. But you can see it a little bit better in this picture. In this case, they're using water from this particular dam downhill from it to grow bananas below the dam. There's also been some increase in water coming out in springs below this one. And then they can hike it back up toward their compounds, and then they water the bananas up there. But they have increased fruit production substantially in this particular area because of the dams going in. So it's pretty exciting to see this in an area that otherwise would be pretty bleak looking. This is just another indication of how many times they put in those grasses because they're so important in this. And this was sort of toward the top end of one of the dams. And of course, as they do this, they're also putting in new terraces in the background, and so on the left side of this picture, you can see those terraces going in. But this is one of the more pleasant stories of this whole project. There was one self-help group called the Kitui Fruit Tree Growers Self-Help Group. And they were a collection of people that had, at this point, 7 dams. And the chairman of the group had a flat area next to his, next to the dam that was closest to his place. And he had turned that into a giant vegetable garden. And in fact, there is a tremendous increase in vegetable production along the sides of these sand dams because of the access to irrigation water. And in his case, and I'll show you this in a minute, but he had an upstream dam as well, and he put a very small pump into that and pumps into 2 1,000-liter barrels that then gravity feed water to the rest of this plot that he's got for vegetable production. The woman in the picture, who would not let me get much closer to take a picture, she was always turning her back on me and kind of going this. So I was trying to be discreet and take a picture of her. But she is one of the victims of the sort of labor problem in Kenya. You have to have some income to send kids to school, to do other kinds of things. You have to participate in the cash economy. And if there are no jobs in the rural area and you can't grow a lot of cash crops, what do you do for money? Well, her husband went off to Nairobi to try to get a job. And then he was killed in an automobile accident in Nairobi, which is unfortunately all too frequent. Nairobi's a busy city. They don't have a lot of controls on their traffic problem, as Louise can attest. And so it's a much higher death rate in there, especially with pedestrian and matatu accidents that happen in town. So she was basically destitute. She'd lost her husband, she didn't have much land, and couldn't afford to send her kids to school or anything like that. But that was about the time they put in the dams. And the head of the Kitui Fruit Tree Growers Association realized that he didn't have enough labor. He was labor short, and she didn't have a job. So he hired her as the chief waterer. And so she came in and started watering all these things, but she loves fruit trees. And he gave her permission to plant fruits. So she's planted these mangoes and avocados, papaya, guava, some citrus, and some other stuff that we don't even have a name for in English, that then provide food for the market and for her own family and for the chair of the group. And then he has her water all the vegetables, and there's different kinds of greens that they grow, and sukuma wiki is a big one that they grow there. They also grow tomatoes and onions and a few other things, and that becomes the market garden. Back here they even have cabbage. I didn't even know they could grow cabbage here, but they grow cabbage as well. And all that goes into the market. So what you're getting with the sand dams is then the ability for local people to participate in the cash economy where they couldn't do that before. And all of this is facilitated because they've met the need for water in that particular area. So that's the chair of the self-help group leading us on a tour of his farm, and you can see the fruit trees in the background and then all the vegetable plots that they have in the foreground on this particular picture. One of the things I haven't talked about enough, though, to this point, is the importance of these community self-help groups and the importance that Utooni gives to those things. I mentioned it a bit in that they kind of force them to form, but these community groups are really essential to the entire process. And they try to make this process as equitable as possible. So one of the lessons I learned was in going to a meeting where they were forming one of these groups. And when we got there to this particular site, and we were going down to the actual stream they were going to build a dam on, at least they hoped to, we were going to talk with them, and they had brought chairs. And they expected the Utooni development leaders and me as the white representative to sit in the chairs. But the Utooni guy said, no. Do you have chairs for your group? Does everybody get a chair? And they said, no, we only have enough chairs for 5 of you. They said, okay, then we'll just sit on the ground. Just take your chairs off. We'll just all sit together. And then they had sodas. They were going to give sodas to us. And the guy that was leading the meeting said, do you have sodas for everybody? I said, no, we only have sodas for you. No, you take the sodas home. You drink them later. We are here to help as partners. We are not in charge of you. You're going to be in charge of this project yourself. And you're going to be treated equally with us. You're our partners. We're not your superiors. And they stressed that over and over again in the meeting. It was something they almost had to teach people because they were used to, in government and even development organization groups, coming in and giving them stuff, including giving them directions. And Utooni didn't want to do that. They wanted the group to determine their own direction. And so they built that up. I mean, they had some requirements and they were stiff. The group had to provide their own money for becoming a self-help group. They had to build the terraces. They had to show that they were working together. But they also knew that if they just gave them the stuff to build the dam, it was likely that they wouldn't take care of the land after they left. So they wanted to develop the caring in the group before they gave the assistance. And that has proven to be probably one of the most important aspects of the group, of these self-help groups, is that they become self-generating of ideas for their own development once they get started. But they've been trained for a long time to have a handout mentality. And Utooni does not want to hand things out. What they'd really like to see is that one self-help group then stimulates the next one to form, and they actually help get the next dam going. And that it snowballs that way instead of always having to come back to the Utooni group itself. And that is shown in how they go about building dams. It's a very equitable process. This fellow right here is named Kevin Makueni, and he is the chairman now of the Utooni Development Organization. Joshua Makushia died in 2012, which happens to older people sometimes. So in any case, he's the guy that's the boss, but he's at the dam sites too. When they build a dam, all the office staff of the Utooni Development Organization comes out and lifts rocks, mixes sand and cement, carries water if it's needed. And in this particular case, it happened to be during a special election for the parliament in Kenya on the day that this dam was being built. And this is a big dam. There were 350 people at this building project. It looked like this, okay? And Kevin was there, and he made a morning announcement. We started at 6 a.m., just after the sunrise. In fact, we saw the sun come up when we got to the site. And he said to everybody, there's going to be a politician coming here to our meeting, and they're going to ask you to stop working and come over and listen to their speech. You are not going to move. You are going to choose a representative of your self-help group to go over to the car and talk to the person that comes to give you the speech. If they come and help us work, then we'll listen to him. It's always a him in this case, okay? But if they don't come to work, we are going to ignore them. And so sure enough, about 3 hours later, the guy comes, gets out his microphone. They had a speaker on top of the truck. You've seen those, I'm sure, in Kenya. And they broadcast to everybody saying, "Come over and talk to us. We'll do this." And so one guy walks over there, talks to him a little bit, walks back, and the car turns around and drives off. The guy lost the election. But who knows what would happen if he had come? Maybe he'd have met the woman that's there leaning up against the rock there on the top. Doesn't look like it, but she's actually a foreman of the building crew. Here she is with her face toward us, took her hat off. This woman is incredible. I saw her in 3 different dam sites, and I had a couple of guys, they were in the study abroad program, who were going into the Marines. And so they were ROTC. And they were really hyper competitive, and they were big. And they loved to lift rocks. They got really into lifting rocks at the dam sites, and they'd compete to see who could lift the biggest rock. And they got one rock, and they couldn't do it by themselves, so they lifted it up together. And they were just huffing and making all kinds of noise. And she was up on top of the dam looking at them, and kind of half smile on her face, and kind of, and maybe a little bit of like, "Who are you guys?" look on her. And they lifted the rock up and just push it up. And she grabbed it from him, picked it up by herself, and moved to where she wanted, dropped it in. And then looked at him and kind of goes, "Get me another one." She was something else. And after that, they would do anything for her. She had them in the palm of her hand. And so they just kept handing her rocks the rest of the day. But on this particular site, this was a 97-meter long dam, 1.5 meters high, 1.5 meters wide at the base, 1 meter across the top, and this community built it in one day. And this is one of the exceptions to the general pattern of Utooni, is they're actually building it for a municipality, the Wote. But there's 6 self-help groups that actually participated in building this particular dam. And a lot of the people from Wote now get their water from this particular dam. This is what it looks like from a Google Earth image. The dam is right here, and the rock that I took the picture on from before is right there at the top. And this is the dam right in here. Backs up water almost 1.5 kilometers in the wet season, and so they have 1.5 kilometers of 2 meters deep of sand as their collection site. And it has reduced the price of water for the entire town of Wote, which is a town of about 30,000 people. So it's pretty effective. Huh? Yeah. I'm almost done anyway, because I think this is the last slide. I'm just proving that I was there. Okay? Had to show myself. Actually, what happened was I was sitting on the rock taking pictures, and some guy came up behind me. I don't even know who he was. Grabbed my camera, said, "I'm taking your picture." He took my picture and then handed me the camera back. So that's the best picture I've had of me on the whole trip. So I kind of like that. But this gives you the idea of what we're doing out there, and pretty much almost finished with the dam. This was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We were all getting tired. At least I was. Maybe they weren't. But it was a very fun day, and it provides a lot of water. But the biggest lesson was how working with people and meeting the needs based on one of the limiting factors that they identify, how much good that can do in a particular location. A lot of times when developers come in from outside and do things for communities, they don't really ask what's going on at the local level and what the local need is. Even Joshua didn't recognize it until his wife pointed it out. Okay? But once you identify a real limiting factor like water and meet that need, it snowballs into a whole number of positive impacts in a community. And that's what they're trying to do there. There's a lot of political pressures and other kinds of things that go on to try to thwart that, but in the end, it has really worked. But it's very much community-based, and that's what it has to be. So I'll stop there. If there are questions, I'll take them from anybody. Okay? Yeah?
So how does, once the sand dam is created and they start planting the grasses or in some cases banana trees, plants,
Right.
there, How does it work with the community in terms of who keeps up that land or how they use the resources after?
Yeah, and that is a community-based decision. Often the ownership patterns of land in a lot of places in Africa, not just here, are based on water supplies. So you have fairly narrow properties that go up and down the hill and go from the bottom to the top, but they're actually relatively narrow. So some cases they actually have frontage on the stream, and whenever that is the case, then they have obviously that part that they can use for plants on the side. However, the stream beds, the entire stream bed where the sand backs up, is not owned by any individual family. It's actually owned by the community. So they take charge of that, and then they have control of it to prevent, say, people misusing the water by having it unprotected from animals so the animals can't poop in it and that kind of stuff. So you have to do that kind of guidelines. But the other aspect that Utooni stresses is that there is no restriction on getting water for personal use on any of these dams. So if you were thirsty and you have a container, you can get water out of that and it's okay. So they don't restrict community. Even those who do not participate in the building of the dam, they're not restricted from water for personal use. They might be restricted though for agriculture, which is a different and higher volume use when you get there. But the community determines that. Utooni doesn't make those rules. They just give guidelines so that community has some guidelines and understanding how that should work.
So that's a related question. So the guy with the pump is obviously going to get an awful lot.
Yeah.
So what sort of determines how much I'm allowed to get with my pump? Can I get a couple more?
And that's a good question. And they've had some experience with having to tell people that they have to restrict their uses so they don't draw it down too much. But every community is a little bit different on how they manage that. And so to give you a blanket universal rule is impossible. The dam that this leader was using was one of the highest dams on their series. And he basically only pumped once a day 2,000 liters of water and then capped it at that. And he would have to go back to the group to get permission to put in a third tank. But
stays in charge.
yeah, the group stayed in charge. And the other thing was, as payment, the self-help group leader provided some of his land to the group so they could grow their own tomato garden for funding for the group. So the group had some of his land so they could grow tomatoes and get money for the group's function. And so that was kind of the way they paid their rent for the water. But every group is going to work out something a little bit different. And if they have disputes, there is actually, Utooni has some people that are specifically trained in dispute resolution about water that will come and help them with that.
You mentioned earlier today that it started with 1 or 2 dams and grew to 3,500 dams in this area. Can you talk just a little bit about how that happened? I mean, was it, did the organization organize cross visits, or how did it expand like that?
It often was related to basically similar to what you would call farmer-to-farmer extension. It happens because neighbors would talk to other neighbors in different places and they'd start seeing how it worked and then begin to expand. But when they reached the point where they realized they needed to develop into an NGO, they had to have some understanding of how to manage the process, because after it started to snowball a bit, they realized they didn't have the management capability to handle all the things they had to order from, cement and some, rebar and shovels and other kinds of equipment and other things. So they brought in some outside help to try to get some management experience for the Utooni Development Organization, and then began to grow it. The other thing is that there is some money involved from outsiders all the time, about $20,000 per dam on average, to supply the cement and the rebar and the labor. And so they needed to be able to raise some money. And so they also had to start learning how to interact with international organizations for some of that and not get captured by those organizations so they could maintain some independence on how they operated. And that took some skills to develop. So it was not just a smooth thing to build up to 3,500. It took a lot of lessons and some errors that had to be corrected and moved back. And they lost a couple of dams early on because they built them too high. So they also had to learn some things about just basic hydrology and physics in order to make them work. Yeah. Okay, Javed.
How supportive were the local governments or national governments?
That's a tricky one. At the national level, they aren't being paid attention to a lot because there's no money in it. They're not raising cash crops for this, in the sense that the international agency is going to be able to ship them out of the country. If they were growing coffee or tea or something that had an international market, the national government would probably get involved. But because they're not, they don't. But at the local level, there's a lot of politicians who want to get credit for actually helping build these dams. And so sometimes they will come and they'll reach in their pocket and give money. And Joshua told a story about one time that happened, and they gave him a whole wad of money, enough to build a dam. It was like $20,000 worth of Kenya shillings. Amazing amount. But it was at a meeting where there was a bunch of self-help groups. So he called the leaders of all these self-help groups, and they talked about it. And so they said, they came up with a plan, and then in the meeting, Joshua said, this politician has given us a big gift for doing this, so we're going to distribute the money to everybody in the room. And so instead of taking the money and putting it in their own pocket, they gave an equal amount to everybody who had attended the meeting. And so it became, for every self-help group, completely diffused the politician. He didn't get what he wanted, he got no control, and everybody walked away from the meeting happy. So they had to work around the politicians to a certain extent to do this. Because anytime you have a successful development, politicians are going to want to own it, so they can take advantage of it for their own election processes. We can learn some lessons on that in the United States, I think. Yeah.
Great. Well, if people need to leave, feel free, but